Some houses hold memories so deep they seem to whisper your name when you walk through empty rooms. For 63-year-old Martha Henderson, the old cabin in Cedar Falls had become both sanctuary and prison, filled with the ghosts of better days. She had learned to find comfort in quiet mornings and simple routines. Her granddaughter Lila's weekend visits were the bright spots that kept her going. But this particular autumn morning would change everything. When 8-year-old Lila came running from the backyard, tears streaming down her face, talking about 2 baby bears crying in the forest, Martha thought it was just imagination. Then she heard them herself, 2 small voices calling through the morning mist, desperate sounds that seemed to plead for help. Wild animals don't usually seek out humans, but these cubs were different. They led Martha and Lila deeper into the woods, to a discovery that would uncover a secret Martha had buried for 20 years. What could make bear cubs trust strangers, and what truth had been hidden in these woods all along? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the pine branches, casting dancing shadows across Martha's weathered hands as she gripped Lila's small fingers. 23 years she had lived in this cabin, and never once had she heard sounds like these. Coming from the deep woods, the thin gold band on her ring finger caught the light, a simple circle that had survived decades of dishwater, garden soil, and tears she'd shed when no one was watching. "Grandma Martha, they're scared," Lila whispered, her 8-year-old voice trembling with the kind of certainty that only children possess. "The babies are calling for help." Martha knelt beside her granddaughter, studying the child's tear-streaked face. Lila had her mother's eyes, Sarah's eyes, dark brown and determined, with that stubborn tilt to her chin that used to drive Martha to distraction 30 years ago. Now it broke her heart. Those same eyes that had glared at her in fury the last time she'd seen her daughter now gazed up at her with complete trust from a face too young to understand how families can shatter like dropped china. The cabin behind them stood silent, its log walls darkened by decades of mountain weather. Henry had built those walls with his own hands during the first year of their marriage, back when their biggest worry was whether the roof would hold through winter storms. Every board, every carefully chinked gap between the logs held memories of a time when the future stretched ahead like an unmarked trail, full of promise. Inside, on the mantelpiece above the stone fireplace, sat Henry's hand-carved wooden robin. He'd whittled it during their courtship, when he was still trying to convince her that a life in the mountains could be as rich as any city dwelling. The delicate bird had been his promise, that their home would always be filled with song, with life, with the kind of love that grows deeper with each passing season. Martha hadn't touched it since the funeral. Some promises, she'd learned, were too painful to keep. The crying sounds came again, drifting through the morning air like a lament. Martha had lived here long enough to know every voice the forest made, the territorial calls of the ravens, the evening songs of the thrushes, the warning barks of the red squirrels. These sounds were different, desperate, young. "Sweetie, bears don't ask people for help," Martha said gently, though even as the words left her mouth, she felt their falseness. In all her years here, she'd seen enough wildlife to know that desperate. Mothers did extraordinary things. "Maybe we should go inside and call your mama." "No!" Lila's voice carried a note of panic. "They'll leave if we don't help them now. Please, Grandma Martha, please." The child's urgency struck something deep in Martha's chest. It was the same tone Sarah had used as a girl when she'd found injured birds in the garden, when she'd begged to keep the orphaned fawn that had wandered into their yard one spring. That endless, stubborn compassion that had made Martha so proud and so afraid at the same time. Martha rose slowly, her joints protesting the morning chill. At 63, she felt every one of her years, especially on days like this when the mountain air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter. The cabin's morning routine called to her, coffee brewing on the old wood stove, oatmeal simmering in Henry's favorite pot. the familiar ritual that kept the loneliness at bay. But Lila's small hand tugged at hers with surprising strength. "This way," Lila said, leading her toward the tree line. "They're just past the big pine, where Grandpa Henry carved our initials." Martha's breath caught. Henry had carved those initials 40 years ago, when they were newlyweds exploring every inch of their new property. MH+HH. Surrounded by a wobbly heart, the letters now grown fat and distorted as the bark had healed around them. She rarely walked that far into the woods anymore. Too many memories lived among those trees, too many conversations with Henry about the children they'd raise here, the grandchildren who would run through these same paths. They'd had Sarah late in their marriage, after years of hoping and grieving over losses that never quite took shape. Sarah had been their miracle, their second chance at building the family they'd dreamed of. For 18 years the cabin had been full of life. Sarah's friends tramping through the kitchen, homework spread across the dining table, the sound of young laughter echoing from the loft bedroom. Then came the accident, Henry's death in a moment of careless attention while helping with a wildlife research project. One step too close to an unstable riverbank. One patch of loose soil, and Martha's world had crumbled like autumn leaves. Sarah, 19 and raw with grief, had blamed her for letting Henry volunteer with the researchers. Martha, drowning in her own guilt and fear, had forbidden Sarah from continuing her father's conservation work. The fight that followed had been brutal, final. Sarah had left that night, and in 20 years they'd exchanged perhaps a dozen carefully polite words. Now Sarah lived 3 states away, working as Martha wasn't even sure anymore. Lila mentioned her mother's job sometimes, something about animals and parks, but Martha had learned not to ask too many questions. It hurt less that way. The crying sounds grew louder as they approached the old pine. Martha's wedding ring seemed heavier on her finger, weighted with all the vows she'd kept and the ones she'd broken. She'd promised Henry she'd take care of. Sarah promised to keep their family together. Instead, pride and fear had driven her daughter away, leaving Martha to rattle around the cabin like a dried bean in an empty pod. "There," Lila pointed toward a cluster of young aspens about 50 yards deeper into the forest. "Can you hear them now?" Martha could. 2 distinct voices, high and distressed, with the unmistakable cadence of cubs calling for their mother. Her heart began to race. Black bears were common in these mountains, but they typically avoided humans. For cubs to approach people, something had to be very wrong. "Lila, honey, we need to be careful. Mother bears can be dangerous when their babies are in trouble." But even as she spoke the warning, Martha found herself stepping forward. The sounds pulled at something primal in her chest, the same instinct that had made her check on Sarah's breathing every night for the first year of her daughter's life. Cubs that young shouldn't be alone in the forest, shouldn't be crying with such desperate intensity. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist that clung to the forest floor. Somewhere in the distance, old Tom Bradley's rooster was growing, probably waking up Martha's neighbor Eva Crenshaw, who would already be starting her famous blueberry muffins for the weekend farmers market. The ordinary rhythms of Cedar Falls continued around them, but Martha felt as though she was stepping into a different world entirely. Cedar Falls wasn't much of a town, maybe 300 people spread across the valley, most of them retirees who'd come to the mountains for the quiet life. There was Peterson's General Store, where Martha bought her weekly groceries, the post office where Chatty Bill Morrison always asked about her health, and Myers' Diner, where the coffee was strong and the gossip stronger. People knew each other's business, looked out for each other's welfare, and respected each other's privacy when it mattered. Martha had been part of that community once. She and Henry had hosted barbecues in their backyard, participated in the annual church fundraiser, served on the volunteer fire department auxiliary. After Henry died, after Sarah left, Martha had gradually withdrawn. Oh, people still waved. When they saw her in town, still asked how she was doing, but she'd become a peripheral figure, the widow who kept to herself, the grandmother who never talked about her family. Lila's weekend visits were the exception to Martha's isolation. Every few months, Sarah would drive the child up from the city and drop her off with barely a word exchanged between mother and grandmother. Lila would spend 2 or 3 days filling the cabin with chatter and laughter, asking endless questions about Grandpa Henry, begging for stories about the old days. Then Sarah would return to collect her, and the silence would settle back over the cabin like dust on unused furniture. Grandma Martha, look, Lila had run ahead, her small figure disappearing behind the aspens. I can see them. Martha's protective instincts flared. Lila, stop, don't get too close. She hurried forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the trees, she caught her first glimpse of them. 2 small black shapes huddled together in a patch of morning sunlight. Cubs, probably 4 or 5 months old, their fur still soft and puppy-like. They were looking directly at her and Lila, not running as wild animals should, but staying perfectly still, as though waiting for help. The larger cub made a sound, a plaintive whine that cut through Martha's careful defenses like a blade. It was the sound of a child calling for its mother, the universal language of young creatures in distress. Martha had heard Sarah make similar sounds as a baby, had answered that call countless times in the middle of the night, stumbling from bed to soothe whatever fears had invaded her daughter's dreams. They're not afraid of us, Lila whispered in wonder. Why aren't they afraid? Martha didn't have an answer. In all her years living on the edge of wilderness, she'd never seen bears behave like this. They should have either fled at the first sight of humans or shown aggression if they felt cornered. Instead, these cubs seemed to be deliberately seeking contact, as though they understood that people might be their only hope. The smaller cub stood on its hind legs, reaching toward them, with tiny paws. The gesture was so human-like, so heartbreakingly vulnerable, that Martha felt tears prick her eyes. Something was very wrong here. Cubs this young should never be separated from their mother, should never be forced to fend for themselves in a world full of larger predators and harsh mountain winters approaching fast. Grandma Martha, Lila said quietly, I think they want us to follow them. The larger cub had indeed begun moving away from them, but slowly, looking back over its shoulder as though checking to make sure they were coming. Its sibling followed, and together they began heading deeper into the forest, toward the part of the woods Martha rarely visited anymore, the part where Henry's research project had been located, where old camping sites and abandoned equipment still marked humanity's attempts to understand the wild creatures who called these mountains home. Martha's wedding ring caught on her jacket zipper as she reached for Lila's hand. For just a moment, the simple gold band seemed to pulse with warmth, as though Henry himself were urging her forward. Into the forest, into whatever mystery these cubs were trying to show them, into a confrontation with truths she'd spent 20 years trying to bury among the pine needles and fallen leaves. All right, Martha said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Let's see what they want to show us. Hand in hand, grandmother and granddaughter followed 2 small bears deeper, into the forest, towards secrets that would change everything they thought they knew about loss, love, and the possibility of second chances. The cubs led them along what had once been a clear trail, but was now overgrown with mountain laurel and wild raspberry canes. Martha recognized the path. She and Henry had walked it hundreds of times during their early years here, back when exploring every inch of their property had felt like the greatest adventure in the world. Now, brambles caught at her jacket, and fallen logs forced them to climb and scramble like much younger people. Lila moved with the easy grace of childhood, hopping over obstacles that made Martha's knees ache just looking at them. The child chattered softly to the cubs as they walked, as though she were having a conversation with old friends. "Don't worry, babies," she murmured. "We're going to help you find your mama." Martha's chest tightened at the word mama. How easily children believed that mothers could be found, that families could be reunited, that love was always strong enough to bridge any gap. At 8 years old, Lila still lived in a world where problems had solutions and help always came when you needed it most. The forest grew thicker around them, the morning light filtering through layers of pine and fir until everything took on a green, underwater quality. Martha had forgotten how quiet it was back here, how the usual sounds of civilization, distant traffic, neighbors' dogs, the hum of power lines, faded away until only the forest's own voice remained. Bird calls echoed from the canopy above, and somewhere nearby, a creek gurgled over stones worn smooth by decades of mountain runoff. The larger cub stopped suddenly, standing on its hind legs and sniffing the air. Its sibling crowded close, and both began making soft, whimpering sounds that raised every protective instinct Martha possessed. These weren't the confident calls of young animals at play. These were the desperate cries of babies who had lost everything that made them feel safe. "What is it?" Lila whispered, though she seemed to sense the change in atmosphere as clearly as Martha did. The cubs moved forward more slowly now, their earlier purposefulness replaced by obvious anxiety. They kept looking back at Martha and Lila, as though drawing courage from the presence of adults who might be able to fix whatever was wrong. Martha felt the weight of their trust, like a physical thing, pressing against her chest with each careful step forward. Then she saw it. 50 yards ahead, where the old trail curved around a massive boulder, something dark and unmoving lay partially, hidden beneath a tangle of fallen branches and autumn debris. At first glance, it might have been just another deadfall, the kind of natural obstacle that littered any forest floor. But as they drew closer, Martha began to make out the familiar shape of a large animal, the distinctive bulk of an adult bear. "Oh, no," she breathed. The mother bear lay on her side, trapped beneath several heavy pine branches that had fallen in a recent windstorm. Her dark fur was matted with dirt and pine needles, and Martha could see immediately that one of her rear legs was bent at an unnatural angle. But her chest rose and fell with labored breathing. She was alive, though clearly injured and unable to free herself from the debris. The cubs rushed to their mother's side, nuzzling against her massive head and making soft mewing sounds. The mother bear lifted her head weakly, touching each cub with her nose, as though reassuring herself that they were unharmed. Then her dark eyes found Martha's, and in that moment of contact, Martha felt something shift deep in her chest. Those eyes held intelligence, pain, and an unmistakable plea for help. This was a mother who had been calling for her babies, just as her babies had been calling for her. The fallen branches had created a prison that kept them apart, leaving the cubs to fend for themselves while their mother fought to survive beneath the weight of the storm's destruction. "Grandma Martha," Lila said in a small voice. "She's hurt bad, isn't she?" Martha knelt beside her granddaughter, her mind racing. The mother bear was clearly in distress, possibly seriously injured. The cubs were too young to survive on their own, especially with winter approaching. But interfering with wild animals was dangerous under the best circumstances, and these were far from the best circumstances. The scene before her triggered a flood of memories so vivid they made her dizzy. Another mother in distress, another moment when quick decisions could mean the difference between life and death. 20 years ago, Sarah had rushed to help an injured deer, while Martha had hesitated, worried about safety, about getting too involved. By the time Martha had convinced her daughter to call for professional help, it had been too late. The deer had died, and Sarah had blamed Martha's caution for the unnecessary loss. "We should have acted faster," Sarah had said, tears streaming down her 19-year-old face. "We should have done something instead of just watching." It had been one of many arguments that year, each one building on the grief and anger that had consumed their household after Henry's death. Martha had been trying to protect her daughter from the risks that had claimed her father, but Sarah had seen only cowardice where Martha intended wisdom. Now, looking into the mother bear's desperate eyes, Martha felt the weight of that old decision. settling on her shoulders like a stone. She could play it safe again, could take Lila back to the cabin and call the authorities from there. By the time help arrived, though, it might be too late for the mother bear, and certainly too late for the cubs, who would never survive a mountain winter without their mother's protection. Hidden in her jewelry box, back at the cabin, wrapped in tissue paper she'd yellowed with age, was half of an old photograph. The other half, the part she'd torn away in a moment of pain so deep it had left scars on her soul, showed the person who had been with them that day they'd tried to help. The injured deer, Sarah's research partner from the wildlife program, the young man who had become like a son to Martha and Henry, the one who had been standing right next to Henry when the riverbank gave way. The torn photograph was a reminder of how quickly help could turn to tragedy, how the best intentions could lead to the worst outcomes. But it was also a reminder of the love that had motivated every decision, even the ones that had ended in heartbreak. "Lila, sweetheart," Martha said carefully, "we need to get help for this bear family. That means calling people who know how to handle wild animals safely." "But what if she dies before they get here?" Lila's voice cracked with emotion. "What if the baby bears can't find food without their mama?" The questions hung in the forest air like morning mist, impossible to ignore. Martha looked at the mother bear again, noting the way her breathing seemed more labored than it had moments before. One of the cubs was trying to nurse, pressing against its mother's belly with the frustrated persistence of a hungry baby. The other cub had curled up against the trapped bear's neck, as though trying to share what little warmth and comfort it could offer. Martha's wedding ring felt tight on her finger, as though the metal itself were responding to the tension of the moment. She thought about Henry, about the man who had never hesitated to help any creature in need. He would have already been pulling branches away, would have found some way to free the mother bear regardless of the personal risk. But Henry was gone. And Martha was responsible not only for her own safety, but for Lila's as well. The child was watching her with absolute trust, waiting for the grandmother who had always been there to somehow make this terrible situation better. The weight of that trust was almost unbearable. "All right," Martha said finally, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to run back to the cabin as fast as you can. Call 911 and tell them we have an injured bear that needs wildlife rescue. Tell them exactly where we are, past the big pine with the carved initials. Follow the old trail toward Bear Creek. Can you remember that?" Lila nodded solemnly. "What are you going to do?" Martha looked at the trapped mother bear, at the cubs who were depending on human help for their survival. "I'm going to stay here and see if I can make her more comfortable until help arrives. Maybe clear away some of the smaller branches if it's safe." It wasn't the cautious response she would have given 20 years ago. It wasn't the safe choice that had cost her so much in the past. It was the choice Henry would have made, the choice Sarah would have wanted her to make, the choice that honored the trust these desperate animals had placed in them. "Run fast, sweetheart," Martha said, kissing Lila's forehead. "This mama is counting on us." Martha watched Lila disappear through the trees, her small figure moving with the urgent purpose of a child on a mission. The forest settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the mother bear's labored breathing and the soft whimpering of her cubs. Alone now with the bear family, Martha felt the full weight of her decision pressing against her chest, like a physical thing. The mother bear's eyes tracked Martha's movements as she approached slowly, hands visible and voice soft, easy. "Mama," she murmured, using the same tone she'd once used to calm Sarah during thunderstorms, "we're going to get you some help." The larger branches pinning the bear were too heavy for Martha to move alone, but she could see several smaller pieces of debris that might be carefully removed. Each movement had to be calculated. One wrong step could panic the injured animal, or cause the remaining branches to shift in dangerous ways. Martha had no illusions about what an adult bear could do, even an injured one protecting her young. As she worked, clearing away pine needles and smaller twigs, Martha's mind drifted to the unopened letter in her kitchen drawer. It had arrived 2 years ago, addressed in Sarah's careful handwriting, postmarked from some place called Glacier Bay. Martha had held it for hours, tracing her daughter's familiar script with trembling fingers, before finally placing it in the drawer next to Henry's old seed packets and the spare batteries for the smoke detector. She told herself she would read it when she was ready, told herself that opening old wounds wouldn't help anyone. But the truth was simpler and more painful. She was afraid of what Sarah might have written, afraid of anger that had festered for 20 years, afraid of blame that might be deserved, afraid of a finality that would close the door on reconciliation forever. The sound of approaching voices made Martha look up from her careful work. Through the trees, she could see Lila returning with Jim Morrison, not the postal worker Bill, but his nephew Jim, who worked for the state wildlife department. Martha had met him a few times around town, a quiet man in his 40s who carried himself with the competent ease of someone comfortable in the wilderness. "Mrs. Henderson?" Jim called as he approached, his voice carefully modulated to avoid startling the bears. "Lila says you've got an injured sow with cubs?" "Over here," Martha replied, stepping back to give him room to assess the situation. "She's been trapped for at least several hours, maybe longer. The cubs led us to her." Jim's eyebrows rose at that detail, but he didn't comment immediately. Instead, he approached the trapped bear with professional caution, studying the arrangement of fallen branches and the animal's condition with practiced eyes. The cubs watched him warily, but didn't retreat, as though they understood that this new human represented potential help. "This is unusual," Jim said quietly, kneeling a safe distance from the mother bear's head. "Cubs this age don't typically approach humans, even in distress. They've had some kind of positive contact with people before." Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What do you mean? See how they're not showing fear responses, how the mother isn't trying to bluff charge or vocalize aggressively despite being trapped. These animals have been habituated to human presence somehow. That's not necessarily good news." Jim pulled out his radio and began calling for backup. A veterinarian experience with large wildlife, additional equipment for moving the heavy branches, possibly a tranquilizer gun if the mother bear became aggressive during the rescue. As he spoke in the clipped, efficient language of emergency response, Martha found herself studying the cubs with new eyes. They were well-fed and healthy-looking, their coats thick and glossy despite their current distress. The larger cub, in particular, showed none of the wariness that wild animals should display around humans. Instead, it watched Jim with something that looked almost like recognition, as though uniformed humans were a familiar sight in its young life. "Mrs. Henderson," Jim said, finishing his radio call, "I need to ask you something. Have you seen these bears around your property before? Any signs of them getting into garbage, bird feeders, anything like that?" Martha shook her head. "Never. I mean, we get bears through the area, but they usually avoid the cabin. These two just appeared this morning, crying in the forest. They seemed to want us to follow them." "And they led you straight here to their mother?" "Yes, almost. Like they knew we could help." Jim was quiet for a moment, studying the scene with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "There used to be research activity in this area, didn't there? Years ago?" The question hit Martha like a physical blow. She felt Lila's small hand slip into hers, warm and trusting, and suddenly she was 20 years in the past, standing in almost this same spot while Henry excitedly explained his volunteer work with the wildlife biology students from the state university. "My husband," Martha said carefully, "worked with some researchers, but that ended when he died, 20 years ago. The equipment's probably still out here somewhere," Jim said, almost to himself. "Old research stations sometimes attract animals long after the humans are gone. Food scraps, artificial shelters, scent trails that persist for years." Martha's throat felt tight. She remembered helping Henry clean up the research site after the accident, remembered the careful packing of equipment and supplies, the official reports that had to be filed. But memory was a tricky thing, and grief had clouded. Those final days of dealing with Henry's research work, had they truly removed everything? Or had some traces remained, creating the kind of artificial environment that might make wild bears comfortable around humans? The sound of breaking branches announced the arrival of Jim's backup team. 3 more vehicles had somehow made it up. The old logging road, carrying a veterinarian, additional wildlife officers, and the specialized equipment needed for a large animal rescue. Martha felt suddenly overwhelmed by the number of people, the professional urgency, the transformation of her quiet forest morning into something that looked like a scene from a nature documentary. "Mrs. Henderson," the veterinarian said, introducing herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, "I understand your granddaughter discovered the situation." Martha nodded, then realized what the woman had said. "Wait, did you say Sarah?" "Dr. Sarah Chen, yes. Is there a problem?" "No, it's just—" Martha stopped herself. Of course there were other people named Sarah in the world. The coincidence shouldn't have affected her so strongly. But hearing her daughter's name spoken by a competent professional woman working to help injured animals felt like a message from the universe she wasn't ready to interpret. Lila tugged at Martha's jacket. "Grandma Martha, look, the baby bears aren't scared anymore." It was true. As the rescue team organized their equipment and discussed strategy, the cubs had actually moved closer to the humans rather than away. The larger cub was sitting upright, in a perfect imitation of a begging dog, while its sibling had stretched out in a patch of sunlight as though settling in to watch the proceedings. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Chen murmured. "It's like they're expecting us to help." Martha watched the cubs' trusting behavior and felt something cold settle in her stomach. These animals weren't just habituated to humans, they were dependent on human help. Somewhere in their brief lives, they had learned that people meant safety, that human voices meant rescue, that the scent of civilization meant survival. The question was, where had they learned those lessons? And what did their presence here mean about the secrets Martha had buried, along with her husband 20 years ago? The rescue operation unfolded with the practiced efficiency of professionals who had handled similar emergencies before. Martha watched from a safe distance as the team worked to carefully lift the heavy branches that trapped the mother bear, using mechanical jacks and rope systems to avoid causing further injury. Dr. Chen monitored the bear's vital signs, while Jim coordinated the delicate process of freeing the animal without triggering a panic response. "She's been here at least 12 hours, Dr. Chen reported, checking the bear's hydration levels and examining the injured leg. "Probably since the storm 2 nights ago. The cubs have been staying close, trying to nurse when they could reach her." Martha felt a stab of guilt. The storm had kept her inside, cozy by the fireplace with a cup of tea and one of her mystery novels. While she'd been comfortable and safe, this mother bear had been fighting for her life just half a mile from Martha's back door. If Lila hadn't heard the cubs crying, how much longer would the family have suffered? As the team worked, neighbors began to arrive. Eva Crenshaw from the next cabin over, drawn by the unusual number of vehicles on the old logging road. Tom Bradley, whose rooster had awakened the mountain, carrying a thermos of coffee and offering help with whatever needed doing. Even Bill Morrison from the post office had driven up, though he stayed well back from the actual rescue operation. "Haven't seen this much excitement since the Henderson place caught lightning 10 years back," Tom said quietly to Martha, accepting a cup of coffee from Eva's ever-present supply. Martha nodded, though she was barely listening to the conversation. Her attention was fixed on Lila, who sat cross-legged on a fallen log about 20 feet from the rescue site, speaking in low tones to the 2 cubs. The animals had positioned themselves on either side of the child, close enough that she could have reached out and touched their fur. Instead, she kept her hands in her lap and simply talked, as though the 3 of them were old friends sharing secrets. "What's she saying to them?" Eva asked, noticing Martha's focus. "I don't know," Martha admitted, "but they seem to understand her." It was true. The cubs' anxiety had visibly decreased since Lila had sat down with them. They no longer paced or whimpered, instead watching the rescue operation with the calm attention of animals who trusted that everything would work out. Every few minutes, one of them would look at Lila as though checking that she was still there, still offering her quiet presence as comfort. Martha's chest tightened with a familiar ache. Sarah had been exactly the same age when she'd started her lifelong love affair with wild creatures. Every injured bird, every lost baby animal, every creature in distress had found its way to their door through Sarah's unwavering compassion. Henry had encouraged it, had seen their daughter's empathy as a gift to be nurtured. Martha had worried constantly about the risks, the diseases, the possibility that Sarah's kind heart would lead her into dangerous situations. In the end, it had been Henry who died helping wild animals, while Sarah survived to carry on his work. The irony wasn't lost on Martha, though it had taken her 20 years to recognize the bitter symmetry of it. "Got her!" Jim called out as the final branch was lifted clear. The mother bear immediately tried to rise, favoring her injured leg, but managing to get to her feet with obvious determination. The cubs rushed to her side, pressing against her massive body with relief so profound it was almost human in its expression. Dr. Chen approached slowly, tranquilizer gun ready but not raised. "The leg's definitely broken, but it's a clean break. With proper care, she should heal completely. The question is whether we can treat her in the field or if we need to relocate the family temporarily." "What does relocating mean?" Lila asked, finally speaking up from her position between the cubs. "Sometimes we have to take injured animals to a rehabilitation facility until they're healthy enough to return to the wild," Jim explained. "It's not ideal, but it's better than letting them suffer or starve." "But what about their home?" Lila's voice carried the kind of distress that only children feel when faced with the possibility of families being separated. What if they can't find their way back? Martha felt the question like a knife to the heart. She thought about Sarah, 3 states away, building a life that had no room for her mother. She thought about the years of stubborn silence, the pride that had grown too large to swallow, the fear that reconciliation might come too late to matter. "Animals are remarkably good at finding their way home," Dr. Chen said gently. "Bears, especially, have excellent spatial memory. Even if we take them away for treatment, they usually return to familiar territory once they're released." "Usually," Lila pressed. "Sometimes they decide they like their new location better," Jim added. "Sometimes they find better food sources, safer denning sites, fewer conflicts with humans. Sometimes what we think of as home isn't necessarily the best place for them to live." Martha watched the bear family reunited, the cubs nursing while their mother stood protectively over them, despite her obvious pain. There was something both beautiful and heartbreaking about their devotion to each other, their willingness to endure suffering rather than abandon their bonds. On Martha's mantelpiece back at the cabin, Henry's leather-bound journal sat in the drawer of the side table, where she'd placed it after the funeral. She'd never been able to read it, the pages filled with his thoughts about parenthood, his dreams for their family's future, his careful observations about the wildlife they shared the mountain with. The journal represented a version of Henry. She'd lost not just to death, but to time, the young father whose dreams had been shaped by hope rather than experience. "Mrs. Henderson," Dr. Chen approached her with a clipboard. "I need to get some information about the discovery for our report. Can you walk me through exactly what happened this morning?" Martha nodded, though she found herself reluctant to leave. The bear family sighed. In the space of a few hours, these animals had become more than just wild creatures in distress. They'd become a mirror reflecting every choice she'd made and failed to make over the past 20 years. Their trust in human help, their refusal to abandon each other despite danger and pain, all of it felt like a lesson Martha wasn't sure she was ready to learn. As she began recounting the morning's events for the official report, Martha found herself, watching Lila's easy connection with the cubs and wondering if some gifts skipped generations. Perhaps the capacity for understanding wild creatures, for seeing beyond species, barriers to the universal language of need and compassion, had passed from Henry through Sarah to land safely in the heart of a granddaughter who had never been. Taught to fear the wilderness, the thought brought both comfort and deep sadness. Sarah should have been here for this moment, should have been the one helping with the rescue, sharing her expertise and passion with her daughter. Instead, Martha stood surrounded by kind neighbors and competent strangers, acutely aware of the empty space where her own daughter should have been. "One more question," Dr. Chen said, pen poised over her clipboard. "You mentioned that your husband worked with researchers in this area. Do you remember what kind of study it was? Any details about the work they were doing?" Martha's wedding ring seemed to tighten around her finger. "Wildlife behavior, I think, tracking movements, studying family groups." She paused, then added, quietly, "He died in an accident while working with them. I tried not to pay too much attention to the details. It was both true and a lie." She'd paid attention to every detail until the moment Henry died. Then she'd shut her mind against anything that reminded her of the work that had taken him away. But now, watching these habituated cubs interact so trustingly with humans, Martha wondered what details she might have forgotten in her grief, and what those forgotten details might mean for understanding why these particular bears had sought human help. By afternoon, the mother bear's condition had stabilized enough for the team to make a crucial decision. Rather than relocating the family, Dr. Chen determined that the break could be treated in the field with a temporary splint, allowing the bears to remain in their familiar territory while the bone healed. It was the best possible outcome, but it meant weeks of monitoring and care that would require daily visits from wildlife officials. "Mrs. Henderson," Jim said as the team prepared to leave. "Given that this happened so close to your property, we'd appreciate your help keeping an eye on them. Nothing hands-on, just letting us know if their behavior changes or if the mother seems to be declining." Martha felt a flutter of anxiety. "I'm not sure I'd know what to look for." "You'd be surprised. You've already demonstrated good instincts by not approaching the mother directly this morning, and your granddaughter seems to have a natural gift with wildlife." Lila beamed at the compliment, though she was careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle the cubs. They had remained close to her throughout the entire rescue operation, occasionally touching her arm with their small paws, as though seeking reassurance. As the rescue vehicles finally pulled away, leaving only the settling dust and the memory of organized chaos, Martha found herself alone in the forest with Lila and 3 bears. The mother bear had chosen a spot about 30 yards away to rest, her splintered legs stretched carefully in front of her. The cubs alternated between nursing and exploring the immediate area, but they never strayed far from either their mother or from Lila. "Grandma Martha," Lila said quietly, "why do you think they're not afraid of people?" It was the question Martha had been dreading, though she couldn't articulate why. "I don't know, sweetheart. Dr. Chen said they've been around humans before. But where? There aren't any other houses up here." Martha looked around the forest, trying to see it through a child's eyes. Lila was right. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and the old logging roads rarely saw traffic anymore. This was deep wilderness, the kind of place where wild animals should maintain their natural fear of humans for their own survival. Unless they had learned different lessons somewhere. Back at the cabin, Martha made grilled cheese sandwiches while Lila drew pictures of the morning's adventure. The child's artwork showed stick figures of herself, Martha, and the bears, all holding hands under a smiling sun. In Lila's world, the day had been a simple story of helping friends in need. "When is Mummy coming to get me?" Lila asked around. "A bite of sandwich. Tomorrow afternoon," Martha replied, though the words felt heavier than usual. Sarah's brief visits to collect Lila were always awkward affairs, stilted conversation about logistics, careful avoidance of anything that might lead to deeper discussion, polite distance that fooled no one. "I wish she could have seen the bears," Lila said wistfully. "She would have loved them." Martha's heart clenched. "How do you know that?" "Because she loves all animals. At home she has pictures of bears and wolves and eagles all over her office. She talks to them sometimes when she thinks I'm not listening." "What does she say?" Lila shrugged with the casual wisdom of childhood. "Mostly she asks them for advice, like when she's worried about work stuff, or when she misses Daddy, or when she's sad about you." The words hit Martha like a physical blow. "Sad about me? She says she made mistakes but doesn't know how to fix them. She says some things are broken too long to put back together." Martha turned away from the table, ostensibly to refill her coffee cup, but really to hide the tears that had sprung to her eyes. In her dresser drawer, wrapped in tissue paper, was half of a family photograph that told the same story. Some breaks seemed too old, too deep, too complicated by pride and time to heal. But outside, in the forest where Henry had once dreamed of studying the intricate relationships between wild creatures, a mother bear was teaching her cubs that sometimes help came from unexpected sources. Sometimes survival meant trusting strangers. Sometimes the very thing you feared might be the thing that saved you. After lunch, Martha and Lila walked back out to check on the bear family. They found the mother bear resting in the same spot, while the cubs played nearby with the unself-conscious joy of young animals who knew their world was safe again. When they saw Lila approaching, both cubs abandoned their game and bounded toward her with obvious delight. "They remember me," Lila whispered in wonder. Martha watched her granddaughter settle cross-legged on the forest floor, while the cubs sniffed her hair and examined her shoelaces with careful paws. There was something magical about the scene, something that spoke to bonds that transcended species and fear. It reminded Martha of stories Henry used to tell about indigenous peoples who believed animals and humans shared the same souls, just wearing different bodies. In her purse, Martha carried a child's drawing that Lila had made years ago during one of her visits. It showed 3 figures holding hands, a tall woman labeled Grandma, a medium woman labeled Mommy, and a small girl labeled Me. They stood in front of a house with a crooked chimney and flowers that looked like purple explosions. At the top of the page, in careful kindergarten letters, Lila had written, "My family." Martha had kept the drawing in her purse for 3 years, pulling it out during lonely moments to remind herself that she was still connected to something larger than her grief and regret. But looking at it now, she realized how much was missing. From the picture, no mention of Grandpa Henry, whose death had started the long slide toward family dissolution. No acknowledgement of the empty spaces that silence had carved between the generations. "Grandma Martha," Lila said, reaching out to gently touch one of the cub's ears, "do you think families can fix themselves when they're broken?" The question hung in the forest air like morning mist, impossible to ignore. Martha looked at the bear family, mother injured but healing, babies safe and learning to trust, all of them together despite the trauma they'd endured. Then she looked at her granddaughter, whose 8-year-old heart still believed in happy endings and second chances. "I think," Martha said carefully, "that some breaks take a long time to heal, but that doesn't mean they can't heal at all." "Like the mama bear's leg?" "Yes, sweetheart, like the mama bear's leg." That evening, after Lila had fallen asleep in the loft bedroom that had once been Sarah's, Martha sat on the front porch with a cup of tea and Henry's old brass compass in her hands. She'd found it in the drawer with his journal, the metal worn smooth by decades of mountain hikes and camping trips, and the needle still pointed true north, steady and reliable even after all these years. Henry had taught her to read a compass during their first summer in the cabin, when everything about mountain living had seemed like an adventure waiting to unfold. "Sometimes you can't see where you're going," he'd said, guiding her fingers over the face of the instrument. "But if you know which direction is true, you can always find your way." The forest was quiet around her, settling into the deep stillness that came with mountain nights. Somewhere out there, the bear family was resting together, the mother's healing body surrounded by the warm comfort of her cubs. Martha wondered if bears dreamed, if the mother bear was reliving the terror of being trapped, or perhaps dreaming of better days when her leg would carry her freely through the forest again. Inside the cabin, her cell phone rang with the sharp insistence that always made her jump. Few people called her landline anymore, and even fewer had her mobile number. Martha hurried inside, hoping the sound wouldn't wake Lila. "Mrs. Henderson?" The voice was unfamiliar. "Professional. This is Dr. Chen. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all. Is something wrong with the bears?" "No, they're fine. I checked on them about an hour ago and the mother is resting comfortably. I'm calling because I found something interesting when I was reviewing the case files from this area. You mentioned that your husband worked with researchers here 20 years ago." Martha's grip tightened on the phone. "Yes, wildlife biology students from the State University. I think I know which study you're referring to. There was a long-term project studying bear family dynamics and territory mapping. The research was discontinued abruptly due to a fatality. One of the volunteers was killed in an accident. That was my husband." "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Henderson. But here's what's interesting. The study documented several bear families with high human habituation levels. Bears that had learned to associate humans with food sources, safety, even medical care. The research team was particularly interested in how this habituation passed from mothers to cubs across generations." Martha felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What are you saying? The bears you found today, they're behaving exactly like the habituated animals from that study. Their comfort level with humans, their willingness to seek help, even their body language around your granddaughter. These could be direct descendants of the original study population." The compass slipped from Martha's free hand, clattering against the wooden floor. "But that was 20 years ago. Bear generations are longer than you might think. A female from the original study could easily have had cubs that survived to reproduce. The behaviors that made them comfortable around humans would have been passed down through learned behavior and example." Martha sank into Henry's old reading chair, the leather cracked and shaped by decades of his presence. "Are you saying these bears have been living near human contact all this time?" "It's possible. The original research site was never fully decommissioned. There might still be traces of human activity that attracted them over the years. Food caches, shelter modifications, scent trails. What I'd like to do, with your permission, is take a team out to locate the old research station. Understanding the full history might help us provide better care for this family." After hanging up, Martha sat in the darkened cabin with her heart racing. 20 years she'd tried to forget every detail of Henry's research work, tried to bury the memories along with her husband. She told herself it was too painful to remember, that dwelling on the circumstances of his death served no purpose. But now it seemed those forgotten details might be crucial to understanding the present situation. In her jewelry box upstairs, the torn photograph seemed to whisper her name. Half a family portrait, carefully divided to remove the person who had been standing next to Henry when he died. Sarah's research partner, the young man who had become like a son to them, who had loved their daughter with the quiet devotion of someone who understood her passion for wildlife. His name had been Daniel Reeves, and he'd been 24 years old when the riverbank collapsed. Martha had blamed him for Henry's death, had accused him of encouraging reckless behavior, of putting research above safety. The fight that followed had been brutal and final. Daniel had left town that same week, and Sarah had never forgiven her mother for driving away the man she'd planned to marry. The torn photograph was all that remained of the future they'd all planned together. Henry would continue his volunteer work with the research team. Sarah would finish her degree and join the project as a full researcher. Daniel would propose at Christmas, and they'd have a wedding in the spring with the whole community celebrating. Martha and Henry would become grandparents to children who grew up loving the wilderness as much as their parents did. Instead, one moment of careless footing had shattered every dream. Henry was gone. Daniel was gone, and Sarah had left town convinced that her mother's need for someone to blame had destroyed any chance at happiness. Martha climbed the stairs slowly, her joints protesting the day's emotional and physical stress. In the loft bedroom, Lila slept peacefully under the same quilt Sarah had used as a child, her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. The child's sketchbook lay open beside her, showing today's drawing of the bear rescue. In Lila's version of events, everyone was smiling. Bears, humans, even the trees seemed to have happy faces. At the foot of the bed sat the small suitcase Lila had brought for the weekend, decorated with stickers of various animals. A wolf sticker caught Martha's eye, then an eagle, then a bear. All wild creatures, all drawn with the kind of accuracy that suggested real knowledge rather than cartoon imagination. Martha wondered what Sarah had taught her daughter about wildlife, what stories she'd shared about growing up in the mountains, what dreams she might be nurturing in her child's heart. Did Lila know that her mother had once planned to be a researcher? Did she understand that her passion for animals came from a family tradition that stretched back generations? Tomorrow, Sarah would come to collect Lila, and Martha would have to decide whether to mention the bear rescue, whether to reveal that the old research site was about to be reopened, whether to risk the fragile peace they'd maintained through 20 years of careful distance. The brass compass on the floor downstairs still pointed true north, steady and reliable in a world that seemed increasingly uncertain. But Martha was no longer sure which direction represented safety and which led toward the kind of truth that might heal old wounds or tear them open beyond repair. The next morning dawned grey and misty, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything smell like wet pine and possibility. Martha woke early, as she always did, but instead of her usual coffee and silence routine, she found herself drawn to the window that overlooked the forest. Somewhere out there, the bear family was beginning another day of healing, another step toward whatever future awaited them. Lila chattered through breakfast about her plans to show her mother the drawings she'd made, the stories she would tell, about helping the baby bears. Martha listened with half her attention, while the other half worried about how to handle Sarah's arrival. Should she mention Dr. Chen's call? Should she prepare her daughter for the possibility that the old research site would be reopened? After breakfast, they walked out to check on the bears one more time before Sarah's arrival. The mother bear was moving more easily, though she still favored her injured leg. The cubs seemed completely comfortable with their presence now, barely, glancing up from their exploration of a fallen log that apparently held fascinating scents and textures. "Look, Grandma Martha," Lila said, pointing to the larger cub. "He's wearing something around his neck." Martha squinted through the morning mist and felt her heart stop. Around the larger cub's neck was a faded collar, barely visible beneath. His thick fur, not the research collar Dr. Chen had mentioned finding on the mother. This was something else, something older and more worn. "We need to call Jim," Martha said, pulling out her cell phone with trembling fingers. "Mrs. Henderson." Jim's voice carried the alert tone of someone always ready for wildlife emergencies. "Is there a problem with the bears? One of the cubs is wearing a collar. Not like the one on the mother. This one looks much older." There was a pause. "I'll be right there." Jim arrived within 20 minutes, bringing Dr. Chen and what looked like a full research team. They set up their equipment with the quiet efficiency of people who'd done this many times before, preparing to safely examine the collar without traumatizing the young bear. "This changes everything," Dr. Chen murmured as she studied the collar through binoculars. "If that cub has been wearing identification since birth, there should be detailed records of his lineage, his mother's history, possibly even his exact birth date." The process of safely removing the collar took most of the morning. The cub had to be temporarily sedated, which distressed his sibling and mother, but allowed the team to conduct a thorough examination. When they finally had the collar in hand, Martha could see that it was indeed ancient by wildlife research standards. Cracked leather, faded markings, and a small metal tag that had been worn nearly smooth by weather and time. "Can you read the identification number?" Jim asked Dr. Chen, who was examining the tag under a magnifying glass. "Barely. It looks like BR04F7. Does that mean anything to you, Mrs. Henderson?" Martha felt the forest spin around her. "I need to sit down." Lila rushed to her side, worry creasing her young face. "Grandma Martha, are you okay?" "BR04, Martha whispered. "Bear Research, 2004. F7 was—" She stopped, her throat closing around. Words that had been buried for 20 years. "Mrs. Henderson," Dr. Chen approached carefully. "What do you remember about F7? She was the first bear Henry successfully tagged. A young female, maybe 2 years old. She'd been orphaned as a cub but survived somehow, became incredibly resourceful. Henry was so proud when she started trusting him enough to accept food offerings. The pieces began falling into place with terrifying clarity. F7 had been the star of Henry's research project, the bear that proved wild animals could develop complex relationships with humans while maintaining their essential wildness. She'd worn her research collar for 3 years, had been tracked and studied and photographed until she became as familiar to the research team as a family pet. "If this cub is wearing F7's collar," Dr. Chen said slowly, "then either he found it after she died, or she passed it to him." Martha finished. "Bears don't normally transfer collars, but F7 was exceptional. Henry always said she understood things other bears didn't. Mrs. Henderson, I need to ask you something important. When the research project ended, what happened to the equipment, the feeding stations, the observation blinds, the supply caches?" Martha's mind raced back through 20 years of trying not to remember. After Henry's death, the university had sent a team to collect their equipment and close down the research site. But she'd been so deep in grief, so focused on planning Henry's funeral and dealing with Sarah's rage, that she'd barely paid attention to the cleanup process. "I don't know," she admitted. I couldn't focus on those details then. "Because if even some of the infrastructure remained," Jim said, "it would explain why these bears have maintained their human habituation. They might have been living around abandoned research facilities for decades." Dr. Chen stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "Mrs. Henderson, we need to locate the original research site. Today. Can you remember how to get there?" Before Martha could answer, the sound of a car engine echoed through the forest. Sarah's SUV, arriving exactly on schedule to collect Lila for the drive back to the city. Martha felt panic rise in her chest. How could she explain what was happening without revealing everything she'd kept hidden for 20 years? "Mommy!" Lila called out, running toward the trail where Sarah would emerge from the parking area. Martha watched her daughter step into the clearing and felt time collapse around her. Sarah looked exactly like her younger self, tall and lean from outdoor work, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, clothes that spoke of someone more comfortable in the field than in an office. But there were lines around her eyes now, a wariness in her posture that hadn't been there at 19. Sarah's gaze swept the scene, wildlife officials, equipment, tranquilized bears, her daughter chattering excitedly about the morning's adventure. Then her eyes found Martha's, and for a moment the 20 years between them disappeared. "What's going on here?" Sarah asked, though her voice held more curiosity than alarm. "Bears! Mommy!" Lila grabbed her mother's hand. "We rescued a mama bear and her babies, and one of the babies was wearing a special collar, and Dr. Chen says it might be from Grandpa Henry's research." Sarah went very still. Grandpa Henry's research? Martha felt the weight of Dr. Chen's and Jim's attention, sensed their growing understanding that this family reunion was about to become something much more complicated. In her locket, the photos of 3 generations of women seemed to pulse with the weight of secrets that could no longer be contained. "Sarah," Martha said carefully, "we need to talk." Her daughter's laugh held no humor. "After 20 years of silence, now you want to talk? Please. It's about the research site, about your father's work, about why these bears behave the way they do around humans." Sarah looked at the tranquilized cub, at the ancient collar in Dr. Chen's hands, at her daughter's eager face. Martha could see the exact moment when her daughter's scientific training overcame her personal anger, when the researcher in Sarah recognized that something extraordinary was happening here. "Show me," Sarah said quietly. "Show me what Dad was working on." The walk to the old research site felt like a journey through time itself. Martha led the group along a trail she hadn't traveled in 20 years, her muscle memory guiding them through turns and landmarks that grief had tried to erase. Sarah walked beside her in careful silence, while Lila skipped ahead with the enthusiasm of a child on an adventure. Behind them, Jim and Dr. Chen followed with their equipment, documenting everything for what was clearly becoming a much larger investigation than anyone had anticipated. "I remember this path," Sarah said suddenly as they passed a distinctive boulder shaped like a sleeping bear. "Dad used to bring me here when I was little. He said the rock was a guardian spirit watching over the forest." Martha's throat tightened. "You were 5 the first time he brought you out here. You insisted on bringing peanut butter sandwiches for any bears we might meet. I'd forgotten that. You'd forgotten a lot of things after—" Martha stopped herself. Some conversations needed to happen in private, not in front of wildlife officials and an 8-year-old granddaughter. The trail began to climb more steeply, winding through stands of old-growth pine that filtered the morning light into cathedral beams. Martha could feel the years falling away with each step, could almost hear Henry's voice explaining the subtle signs of animal passages, the way bark scratches told stories of territorial markings, the delicate balance between observation and interference that defined ethical wildlife research. "There," Martha said as they crested a small ridge. The research station was just down there in that clearing by the creek. But what they found was far more than Martha had expected. The abandoned research site was clearly still in use. Someone had maintained the observation blinds, repaired the equipment shelters, and even expanded the original infrastructure. Fresh tire tracks led to a small parking area that definitely hadn't existed during Henry's time, and solar panels glinted from the roof of what looked like a modern field laboratory. "Mrs. Henderson," Dr. Chen said quietly, "who has access to this land? It's all part of our property," Martha replied, though her voice sounded uncertain even to herself. At least it was 20 years ago. Jim was examining the fresh tire tracks with the focused attention of someone trained in investigation. "These are recent. Within the last few days. Someone's been here regularly for years, maybe decades." Sarah had gone very still beside her, and Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Sarah, do you know something about this?" Her daughter was staring at the expanded research station with an expression Martha couldn't read. "I need to make a phone call," Sarah said abruptly. "To whom?" "To someone who should have told me the truth a long time ago." Sarah pulled out her cell phone and walked a few steps away from the group. Martha couldn't hear the conversation clearly, but she could see the tension in her daughter's shoulders, the way her free hand clenched and unclenched as she spoke. When Sarah finally returned, her face was pale but determined. "Daniel's been continuing Dad's research," she said without preamble. "All these years. He never left the area. He just moved the operation deeper into the forest where you wouldn't accidentally find it." Martha felt the forest tilt around her. "Daniel Reeves, but he left town after you accused him of causing Dad's death." "Yes, I know. But he didn't leave the mountains. He's been living in a cabin about 5 miles from here, maintaining the research station, caring for the bear families Dad started studying." "That's impossible. I would have known." "Would you?" Sarah's voice carried 20 years of accumulated pain. "When was the last time you hiked more than half a mile from your cabin? When did you last explore the deep forest, the places Dad loved?" "Most." Martha realized with growing horror that her daughter was right. Grief had shrunk her world to the immediate vicinity of the cabin, the safe circle of known trails and familiar landmarks. She'd been living in the mountains for 20 years, without truly inhabiting them, surviving rather than exploring. Sarah, Dr. Chen interrupted gently, if Dr. Reeves has been continuing the research, we need to contact him immediately. His records could be crucial for understanding these bears' behavior patterns. He's on his way, Sarah said. I told him about the rescue, about the collar, about everything. He should be here within the hour. The weight of impending confrontation settled over Martha like a physical thing. Daniel Reeves, the young man she'd blamed for Henry's death, the man she'd driven away with her grief and rage, the man her daughter had planned to marry, was about to walk back into her life, carrying 20 years of secrets and possibly 20 years of resentment. Lila, bored with adult conversation she didn't understand, had wandered toward the creek that bordered the research site. "Grandma Martha," she called suddenly, "there's something in the water." They rushed to where Lila stood, pointing at what looked like a partially submerged metal container. Jim waded into the shallow creek and carefully lifted out a waterproof case that had clearly been there for some time. "Henry's field notes," Martha whispered, as Jim opened the case to reveal dozens of notebooks wrapped in plastic. "I thought they were lost in the accident." Dr. Chen handled the notebooks with the reverence of someone who understood their scientific value. The pages were filled with Henry's careful handwriting, detailed observations about bear family structures, territory mapping, behavioral patterns across generations. But more than that, they contained his thoughts about parenthood, his dreams for his daughter's future, his vision of a family legacy built around conservation and understanding. "Look at this entry," Dr. Chen said, pointing to a page dated just weeks before Henry's death. "F7 continues to demonstrate remarkable adaptation to human presence. More importantly, she's teaching these behaviors to other bears in the area. If we're right about learned behavior transmission, the implications for long-term human-wildlife interaction could be revolutionary. Sarah has expressed interest in making this the focus of her graduate work. With Daniel's help, she could take this research in directions I've never imagined." Martha sank onto a fallen log, overwhelmed by the weight of her husband's dreams and her own failures. Henry had seen a future where Sarah and Daniel would continue his work together, where their love for each other and for the wilderness would create something beautiful and lasting. Instead, Martha's need for someone to blame had destroyed that. Future had scattered the pieces of their family like leaves in a winter storm. Mrs. Henderson, a new voice, deeper and older than Martha remembered, but unmistakably familiar. She looked up to see Daniel Reeves walking into the clearing and felt her heart skip with recognition and regret. He was 54 now, his dark hair streaked with silver, his face weathered by decades of outdoor work. But his eyes were the same, kind, intelligent, and full of the patient compassion that had made him perfect for both wildlife research and for loving her complicated daughter. "Hello, Martha," he said quietly. "Daniel." She struggled to find words that could bridge 20 years of silence and misunderstanding. "I didn't know. Sarah said you've been living up here all this time." Someone had to continue Henry's work. Someone had to take care of the bears he'd started studying. "But I thought, after the accident, after what I said to you..." Daniel settled onto a boulder across from her, his posture relaxed despite the obvious tension of the moment. "You were grieving, Martha. You'd lost the most important person in your world, and you needed someone to blame. I understood that, even if it hurt." Sarah had moved to stand beside Daniel, and Martha noticed how naturally they positioned themselves near each other, how easily they fell into the rhythm of people who had shared decades of work and worry. The realization hit her like a physical blow. "You two, you've been together all this time. Not together in the way we planned when we were young," Sarah said carefully, "but we've been partners in the research. Daniel never gave up on Dad's vision, and eventually I realized I couldn't either. Why didn't you tell me?" The question hung in the forest air like morning mist, heavy with 20 years of lost opportunities and misunderstood intentions. Martha looked at her daughter, at the man who should have been her son-in-law, at the granddaughter who was just beginning to understand that the adult world was far more complicated than she'd imagined. In her locket, the photos of 3 generations of women seemed to pulse with the weight of secrets finally coming to light. The truth was more complex than she'd ever imagined, and far more hopeful than she'd dared to dream. The silence stretched between them like a chasm 20 years in the making. Martha stared at Sarah and Daniel, trying to process not just their words, but the easy familiarity between them. The way they stood close enough to touch, but carefully. The weight of shared history that suddenly felt both foreign and achingly familiar. "You could have told me," Martha said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "All these years I thought I'd destroyed everything. I thought I'd driven you both away permanently." Sarah's laugh held no humor. "You made it very clear that you blamed Daniel for Dad's death. You told him he was reckless, that his research priorities put people at risk, that you never wanted to see him again. What was I supposed to do? Choose between my mother and the man I loved? So you chose him." "I chose Dad's work," Sarah corrected firmly. "I chose to honor what he started, to continue the research that meant everything to him. Daniel made that possible." Martha felt something break loose in her chest, 20 years of carefully constructed defenses crumbling like old mortar. "I was wrong," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "I was so angry, so lost after Henry died. I needed someone to blame, and Daniel was there, and I just—" She stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her mistakes. Daniel stepped forward, his weathered hands gentle as he knelt beside Martha's fallen log. "Martha, Henry's death wasn't anyone's fault. The riverbank was unstable, we all knew that. He was trying to help an injured beaver kit and the soil gave way. It was an accident, nothing more. But if you hadn't been doing the research, if he hadn't been volunteering, then he wouldn't have been the man you fell in love with," Daniel said quietly. "Henry lived for those moments when he could help wild creatures. Taking that away from him would have been like asking him to stop breathing." From her pocket, Sarah pulled out a worn wildlife research badge, the kind issued to certified field researchers. The photo showed a younger Sarah, but the confidence in her eyes was unmistakable. "I became a wildlife biologist, Mom, just like Dad wanted, just like you forbade me to do." Martha stared at the badge, at the official confirmation of everything she'd tried to prevent. "Where?" "Glacier Bay, Alaska. I've been studying bear populations there for 15 years. Daniel helped me get the position, helped me understand that I could honor Dad's memory while staying safe." "Alaska," Martha whispered, thinking of the unopened letter in her kitchen drawer, the one postmarked from Glacier Bay. "That's why you moved so far away." "I moved away because every time I came home, you looked at me like I was going to die, the same way Dad did. You were so afraid of losing me that you couldn't bear to let me live." The truth hit Martha like a physical blow. She had been afraid, terrified that Sarah's passion for wildlife would lead to the same tragic end that had claimed Henry. But in trying to protect her daughter from risk, she'd pushed her away entirely, had lost 20 years of watching Sarah grow into the remarkable woman she'd always been meant to become. "The cubs," Lila said suddenly, her 8-year-old voice cutting through the adult tension with startling clarity. "They're scared again." Everyone turned to look toward the creek, where the 2 bear cubs had emerged from their exploration of the research site. They were making the same distressed sounds Martha had first heard that morning, the plaintive calls that had started this entire revelation. But now their mother was nowhere to be seen. "Where's the mother bear?" Dr. Chen asked, immediately alert to the change in the animal's behavior. Daniel was already moving toward the cubs, his body language calm but urgent. She must have heard us talking, smelled unfamiliar scents. Injured animals often relocate when they feel threatened. "But she can barely walk," Martha protested. "Exactly, which means she's not far, but she's probably hiding somewhere she feels safer." The cubs are calling for her, but they're also staying close to us because they've learned humans mean help. Sarah was studying the cubs' behavior with the trained eye of a professional researcher. They're not just distressed. They're trying to lead us somewhere again. Look at their body language. She was right. The larger cub was moving toward the deeper forest, looking back over his shoulder with the same purposeful expression he'd shown that morning when leading them to his trapped mother. His sibling followed, and both cubs began making soft, encouraging sounds, not distress calls, but the kind of communication bears use to guide each other towards safety. "They want us to follow them again," Lila said with absolute certainty. Martha looked at her daughter, at Daniel, at the wildlife officials who had become witnesses to a family reunion 20 years in the making. The morning had already shattered every assumption she'd held about the past. Now, the bear cubs were asking them to venture even deeper into unknown territory, to trust their animal wisdom one more time. "All right," Martha said, rising from the fallen log with determination she hadn't felt in decades. "Let's see what they want to show us now." The cubs led them along a path that seemed to exist only in their memory, through dense undergrowth and around massive deadfalls that would have been impassable without their guidance. Martha found herself walking between Sarah and Daniel, the three of them moving together for the first time in 20 years, following two small bears toward whatever resolution awaited them in the deep forest. "There," Daniel said softly, pointing ahead to where the mother bear lay in a natural shelter formed by fallen logs and overhanging rocks. She found the old den site. Martha caught her breath. She remembered this place. Henry had discovered it during his first year of research, a natural bear den that had been used for generations. The entrance was partially concealed by mountain laurel, but the interior was spacious and well protected from weather and predators. F7 used this den when she was pregnant, Daniel continued, his voice filled with recognition. She gave birth to her first cubs here, raised them through their first winter. If this mother bear brought her family here, it means she knows this place is safe. The mother bear lifted her head as they approached, her dark eyes alert but not frightened. The cubs rushed to her side, nuzzling against her massive body with obvious relief. But what captured Martha's attention was what lay beside the bear, a collection of objects that clearly didn't belong in a natural den. "Henry's camera equipment," Sarah whispered, moving closer to examine the cache, "and his field journals, the ones we thought were lost." Daniel knelt carefully near the den entrance, his movements slow and non-threatening. F7 must have collected these things after the accident. Bears sometimes gather objects that carry familiar scents, especially items associated with food or safety. Martha felt tears start to fall as she recognized pieces of Henry's research gear, a battered clipboard, a metal measuring tape, even the thermos he'd used for coffee during long observation sessions. For 20 years, while she'd grieved his absence, F7 had been preserving his memory in her own way, passing down not just learned behaviors, but actual artifacts from the research that had meant so much to both species. "Mom," Sarah said gently, holding up a leather-bound notebook that had been wrapped in what looked like an old research jacket. "Look at this." The notebook fell open to a page dated just 3 days before Henry's death. In his familiar handwriting, Martha read words that made her chest ache with love and regret. "Sarah has decided to pursue wildlife biology as her major. Daniel has offered to mentor her through the application process for graduate programs. I couldn't be prouder of the woman she's becoming, or more grateful for the young man who loves her enough to support her dreams. Martha worries about the risks, but I know our daughter will find ways to be both passionate and careful. Some things are worth the risk. Love is worth the risk. Understanding is worth the risk." "He wasn't reckless," Martha said, her voice breaking. "He knew the dangers, but he thought some things were worth the risk, including trusting me to keep Sarah safe," Daniel added quietly. "That's what he was doing the day he died, teaching me how to approach wildlife situations with both courage and caution. He died trying to save a beaver kit, but he also died passing on his knowledge to the next generation. Sarah had pulled out her cell phone and was photographing the cache of Henry's belongings, documenting their discovery with the systematic thoroughness of a trained researcher. "This is extraordinary," she murmured. "Multi-generational inheritance of both learned behaviors and material objects. It's unprecedented in bear research." "Sarah," Martha said suddenly, "the letter you sent me 2 years ago. I never opened it." Her daughter looked up from her photography, surprise and pain flickering across her features. "You kept it? In my kitchen drawer. I was afraid you were writing to tell me you never wanted to see me again. I was writing to tell you that I'd gotten a promotion, that I was being offered a position leading a new research station in Alaska, and that I wanted you to be proud of me even if you couldn't support what I was doing." The words hung in the forest air like a benediction. Martha realized that while she'd spent 20 years fearing her daughter's anger, Sarah had spent those same years longing for her mother's approval. They'd been separated not by hatred, but by mutual misunderstanding, each afraid to reach across the chasm that grief and pride had created between them. Lila, who had been quietly observing the adult emotions swirling around her, suddenly stepped forward and pulled something from her pocket. It was a family photo she'd taken with her phone that morning, showing Martha, Sarah, and herself with the rescued bear cubs. In the picture, all 3 generations of women were smiling, united by their shared concern for the animals that had brought them together. "Look," Lila said with the wisdom that sometimes comes from the mouths of children. "We're all here now. Grandma Martha, Mommy, me, and the bear family. Everybody's safe, everybody's together, and everybody's going to be okay." Martha looked at the photo, at her daughter's face bright with professional excitement and personal joy, at her granddaughter's absolute confidence that love could overcome any obstacle. In Lila's version of the world, families could heal, mistakes could be forgiven, and happy endings were always possible for those brave enough to reach for them. 6 months later, Martha stood in the same forest clearing where everything had changed, but now the space hummed with purposeful activity. The old research station had been rebuilt and expanded into the Henry Henderson Wildlife Research Center, a collaboration between the State University, the Wildlife Department, and a small but passionate team of researchers led by Dr. Sarah Henderson Reeves. Yes, Henderson Reeves. Sarah and Daniel had finally married the previous month in a simple ceremony held right here in the forest, with Lila as flower girl and the bear family as unofficial witnesses from a respectful distance. Martha had walked her daughter down the aisle they'd created between the pine trees, 25 years late, but with a heart finally ready to celebrate love instead of fearing loss. The mother bear, fully healed now, watched their activities with the benign interest of someone observing. Busy neighbors. Her cubs had grown substantially over the winter, though they still showed their unusual comfort around humans. The research team was documenting their behavior as part of a groundbreaking study on multi-generational human-wildlife interaction. "Grandma." "Martha," Lila called from the observation blind, where she was helping Sarah catalogue the morning's behavioral observations. "Come see what the cubs are doing." Martha walked over to find the 2 young bears engaged in what could only be described as play-fighting, tumbling through the forest clearing with the joyful abandon of children who know they're completely safe. Their mother dozed nearby, occasionally opening one eye to check on her offspring, but mostly content to let them explore their world without fear. "They're teaching each other," Sarah explained, making notes on her tablet. "The larger cub has learned to climb that particular tree safely, and now he's showing his sibling the technique. It's exactly the kind of knowledge transfer Dad hypothesized about in his original research." Martha nodded, though her attention was drawn to a different scene entirely. Near the creek, Daniel was showing Lila how to use the water quality testing equipment, their heads bent together over a set of measurement tools with the concentration of teacher and eager student. At 10 years old now, Lila had declared her intention to become a wildlife biologist, just like Mommy and Uncle Daniel, and she approached every aspect of the research with scientific curiosity and boundless enthusiasm. The community had embraced the research center with unexpected warmth. Eva Crenshaw had started bringing fresh muffins for the team every Wednesday, claiming that people doing important work needed proper nutrition. Tom Bradley had volunteered to maintain the access roads with his tractor, grumbling about city folk who didn't know how to handle mountain driving, but secretly proud to be part of something that brought positive attention to Cedar Falls. Even Bill Morrison had gotten involved, creating an informal communication network that kept the whole valley informed about the bears' progress and the research discoveries that were attracting attention from wildlife biologists across the country. "Martha," Daniel said, approaching with Lila in tow, "we've got the results back from the genetics testing on F7's collar." And she was indeed the original F7 from Henry's study. But more than that, the current mother bear is her daughter, and these cubs are her grandchildren. We're looking at 3 generations of bears who have learned to coexist peacefully with humans while maintaining their essential wildness. Martha felt a familiar tightness in her chest, but this time it was wonder rather than grief. So, Henry's research is still happening. It's been continuing all these years through the bears themselves. Exactly. And Sarah's work in Alaska has provided comparative data that's going to revolutionize how we understand human-wildlife interaction. The paper we're writing together could change conservation policy across North America. Sarah approached with a thermos of coffee and the satisfied expression of someone whose morning fieldwork had gone exactly as planned. "Mom, I wanted to ask you something. The university has offered funding for a permanent research position here at the center, someone to coordinate community outreach and educational programs." "That sounds wonderful. Who are you thinking of hiring?" "You," Sarah said. "Simply, if you want it." The job would involve sharing Dad's story, helping people understand the research, maybe writing a book about the bear families and what they've taught us about families in general. Martha felt the offer settle around her like sunlight after a long winter. For 6 months, she'd been volunteering at the research center, gradually discovering that she had a gift for translating complex scientific concepts into stories that touched people's hearts. The idea of making it official, of having a real purpose beyond maintaining her quiet existence, felt both terrifying and wonderful. "I'll need to think about it," she said, though she already knew her answer. They walked back toward the cabin. Together, 4 generations if you counted the bear family following at a distance. Lila chattered about her latest discovery, evidence that the cubs were learning to identify safe plants by watching not just their mother, but also the human researchers. Sarah and Daniel discussed plans for expanding the study to include other bear families in the region. Martha listened to their voices weaving together and felt the deep satisfaction of a family finally complete. On the mantelpiece at home, Henry's hand-carved robin no longer sat alone. It was now surrounded by photos of the research center, newspaper, clippings about their groundbreaking discoveries, and a small oak sapling growing in a pot by the window. They would plant the tree next month, on the anniversary of Henry's death, as a living memorial to dreams that had taken 20 years to fully bloom. The brass compass still pointed true north, reliable and steady in a world that had proved far more forgiving than Martha had ever dared to hope. Sometimes you couldn't see where you were going, but if you knew which direction was true, you could always find your way home. Even if home turned out to be different than you'd imagined, even if the journey took longer than you'd planned, even if the path led through forests you'd never expected to explore. Love, Martha had finally learned, was worth the risk. Understanding was worth the risk. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, second chances came disguised as baby bears crying in the forest, asking for exactly the kind of help you never knew you had to give.